everyone. This is Group 2. I'm Jade, the writer-presenter. Juan is our theorist, and Andres is our econometrician. Today we're going to be presenting on how government incentives influence electric vehicle adoption rates and increase sales. Before we start, I'd like to mention that we mainly will be focusing on financial incentives of state and government levels, but we also will be mentioning qualitative incentives along the way as well. So to start off in our introduction, combustion engine vehicles are the second largest greenhouse gas emitters of the world, and the United States is one of the larger emitters of greenhouse gases due to our car-dependent way of life, and the subsidized push to EVs will lead us to cut down on our tailpipe emissions. John Maynard Keynes' theory is the relationship between government investment and the change in output, and this will be more explained by Juan later on. The U.S. Energy Policy Act of 2005 introduced incentives for fuel-efficient vehicles. The 2022 U.S. tax cut of up to $7,500 is the main incentive that we will be presenting on today, and this applies to all electric and plug-in hybrid cars purchased new in or after 2010, and the economic benefit of this is the economic benefit of fuel-efficient vehicles is that it reduces fuel costs and it shifts people to get more locally produced electricity sources. In 2021, the overall public spending on subsidies and incentives for electric vehicles doubled to almost about $30 billion. Next is our literature review, where I found that some major themes and categories were social, economic, geographic, and policy factors, some which are stated to the right, but ones that are more prevalent within the readings were energy prices and or savings, environmentalism, and direct financial incentives, which leads us to financial burdens and benefits. One benefit was that states with less expensive electricity or higher gas prices have a greater share of BEV interest, and BEV stands for battery electric vehicles, and an opportunity cost of converting over to EVs is the charging time versus the time of going to a gas station, and this is all stated within the literature that was read. Another benefit is the financial purchase incentives are most effective when GDP changes and incentives are above the average level, and this cycle continues through the new registrations of EVs that then increase GDP. And this was all found through a study from the UK, but this still applies to some benefits that happen within the United States. A burden that a lot of people or a lot of the literature was speaking about was the high upfront costs and apprehensions, and one of them is that incentives may be less effective because of the lag time between the time of purchase and the time when the buyer receives the money or tax cut. And this can be due to inflation, as their money was maybe more valuable during their time of purchase or other factors throughout the line. Human behavior desires the price deduction at the time of purchase or the money up front, as a lot of people do not like to wait for something like that. And especially if they make their purchases at or around the time of tax season, because that means that they have to wait until the next year to receive that money or receive that tax cut. And another apprehension that is very prevalent throughout the literature was that infrastructure, and the infrastructure that supports EVs are usually charging stations and ports, or the lack of, usually within apartment complexes, at work, during travel, at school. A lot of the results that were found through the literature was that there's a positive correlation between infrastructure and market shares, or infrastructure and fuel costs, or infrastructure and adoption rates, or sometimes even all three. Non-residential charging increases the utility of BEVs, so additional cost savings, additional travel, and the convenience and efficiency of having those non-residential charging stations. So again, at work, at school, or on the road, and sometimes even at grocery stores or plazas. And charging outlets are in demand due to PEV drivers, and PEV drivers are, PEV stands for plug in electric vehicles. And plug in electric vehicles usually includes hybrids, which are run off of gas and electricity. So this is not endogenous to EV cells, but the demand does affect cells just from the outside.
Thank you, Jade. While doing researching and investigating our hypothesis, figuring out what theory relates to our hypothesis, what it correlates to our hypothesis, our team, with the research we found, and the theory that we found that went well with our hypothesis was we found that the Caucasian theory relates to our hypothesis. We know the Caucasian theory was founded by or made by John Maynard Keynes, an English economist, and he's the one that changed the theory and practice of microeconomics and economic policies of governments. And this theory relates to our hypothesis because we know the Caucasian theory, when the government spends or invests, it causes the output to change. Our hypothesis connects to this theory because we saw the United States government adding incentives, in other words, investing to push or increase sales of electric vehicles. This also caused to have a positive outcome, which helps stabilize economic output when demand is low or high or during times with high inflation. We saw that output measured by the increase of sales of EVs. Something, moreover, going on to the supply and demand side, going on to the seller side, we saw when sellers levy the reduced cost of doing business, it causes the movement to pay the consumers and firms. This causes the demand shift to go up. For example, in 2010, my group found a study that the U.S. government added $1,000 incentive in owning an electric vehicle. This incentive was deducted in the taxes, and when this incentive caused an increase in hybrids, market changed by more than 30%. This means that when incentives were put into it, more hybrids were bought, and we saw that there was a 30% jump. Also, we could see how the demand shifted up because of the incentives that were implemented. This made to push towards more EVs, the United States mission, or to promote or to get more people in buying electric vehicles because there was a 2030 bill that got passed that they wanted more EVs rather than gasoline. But on the buyer side, we could see there is a reduction on the tax burden of a firm or consumer with deductions, exemptions, and credits, causes the demand shift to go down. This is aimed at incentivizing specific behavior. And then again, when the government increases spending on input in order to increase output. Here, in our case, the input here is the tax incentives and the electric vehicles, and our output is higher adoption rates and sales. And overall, my group found a study that we could see electric vehicle sales in the US more than doubled to 630,000. We could see when more incentives were in place, there was a jump in sales that happened. I'm going to the levied on supply subside graph. We saw when the tax was implemented, the that tax reduction or the incentives, we saw the demand shift could go was going up when there was no tax incentives. It was it was lower than usual. You could see how the demand shifted and increased, and this shows how it happened.
Hello, my name is Andres Estrada, and I'll be presenting the data section of this presentation. Our data for this observational study centered around the annual sales of EVs in the United States, specifically each state. We wanted to look at the adoption rate of sales. Uh, the data was collected from SurfKey, which is a research analysis and review website. The data had annual sales of EVs from the years 2016 to 2020. With the data, we were able to create the cell adoption rate percentage variable with the following formula. We used current year sales minus the past year sales divided by the past year sales times 100, which would give us the adoption rate percentage of the current year. This would give us the variable that we would need to analyze to see if there's a significant difference between states that provide additional monetary incentives and states that only rely on the 7,500 tax credit from the federal government. For incentives, we collected data from the U.S. Department of Energy, specifically their database where they stored past and present EV incentive programs. The data was collected in two different ways. One was a binary data set, and another one was a numeric data set, which we would be using as explanatory variables. One would be used as a t-test, which would be the binary variable, and the other one would be used for a linear regression model, so that one would be the numeric variable. The binary variable input was yes if the state provided incentive, and no if it did not provide additional incentive. The numeric variable had a fixed amount of 7,500 if the states did not provide additional incentives, and if the states did provide additional incentives, they would have a fixed amount of 7,500, which was added to the highest amount possible that the state would give with the tax credit of the federal government. The only issue with the incentive collection was that you had to search individually by state. Not many states were clear on whether EVs were part of the incentive, so many states were left out. Also, they weren't specific for a year, so another reason why states were left out, they didn't explain if it was between 2016 or it would have been 2014. Our incentives that we collected were primarily tax credits, tax exemptions, or rebates. We didn't really look into other incentives other than monetary. We did not include HOV lanes, since those are not monetary, more exclusive if you're driving an EV. For our means comparison tests, we had another issue. One of the issues that arose was that the 2019 and 2020 data failed to give us a normal distribution assumption. So to create a better test, we decided to use only 2017 and 18 and combine it, which would give us 100 observations. Our hypothesis for the means test is that states that provide monetary incentives will have a greater adoption rate than states that do not provide additional incentives. Our null hypothesis for this t-test is that the average adoption rate percentage of both states that do or do not provide incentives are equal to each other. The alternative hypothesis, which is our hypothesis, was that the average adoption rate percentage of states that do not provide incentives is less than states that do provide incentives. We measured this at a 95% confidence interval. Our results were that since the p-value is greater than the significance value, we retain the null hypothesis and conclude that the average adoption rate percentage of states that do not provide additional incentives is not significantly less than states that does provide these additional incentives. So our result concluded that the states that provided additional incentives had on average higher adoption rates. As you can see the graphs, they are higher. There's a 12% difference between yes and no groups, but it was not significantly greater than states that did not provide these additional monetary incentives. So our mean test uh, results was that we retained the null hypothesis. For our linear regression model, we wanted to find out if states instead had an association or correlation with EV adoption rates. In the linear model for this analysis, we looked at the response variable as adoption rate percentage and the explanatory variable as the dollar amount of incentives a state would provide. So if the state did not provide anything, they would have a base price of 7,500. And if they did provide, then that 7,500 was added with the incentives they were giving. So if a state gave a 3,000 extra incentives, it would be added to the 7,500 incentive. Uh, Looking, our data observes 2 years of adoption rates from 50 states. So in total, it gave us 100 observations. The base price has been told is 7,500. Due to inflation, the next year would be 700 7,350. Uh, those would be the base prices of 2018. So 2018 prices were lowered because due to inflation. That would be the base price for 2018. Our model predicted that at $0 incentive provided by states, the adoption rate will be equal to 53.6%, and will increase 1.32% for every $1,000 in incentives given. Uh, but the low R squared value of 0.0019 showed that it had a low association between the variables, so the testing models was cut short due to it not being so different to the average uh, linear model, which could be seen with the green line compared to the black line. Maybe a better model would have been better to use. Maybe instead of looking at cells, we could have looked at registrations, or maybe instead of states, we could have looked at individual vehicles and see if those vehicles were uh, increased by incentives uh, rather than states.
So, to finish us off with our conclusion and results, I'd like to restate our hypothesis, which is how do financial incentives for electric vehicle adoption rates increase sales? And from our hypothesis, we found additional incentives do not significantly increase the adoption rate of EV sales. And there is no association between adoption rates and the potential incentives that may have been given. To get the results and conclusion we were looking for, different approaches may be needed, and a lot of those were seen throughout our literature, which was using a registration instead of sales. Variations within the hypothesis may have skewed the results, such as infrastructure, personal incentives, like environmental well being, and standards like codes and restrictions. Ultimately, through our research, we concluded our hypothesis is false, but we hope this will change as the years progress and more data is collected. Thank you.